All right, thanks everybody for coming to the Biogeochemistry Science Friday today. We have a guest speaker, Nate McDowell from Pacific Northwest National Lab, who's going to talk about VPD and CO2. So please take it away, Nate.
Thank you very much, Forrest, for the invitation, and thanks to everybody for attending. I do hope this is interesting. This is the first time this talk's been given, so it may have lots of room for improvement. So I welcome all kinds of feedback that's available, critical, scientific, etc. So Ruby and I put this together, but we've been thinking about this for a couple of years now, about this conflict between the rising vapor pressure deficit that we're witnessing and the rising CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere, because they impact us at the stomatal level of sub-leaf scale all the way to global climate. So we see a synergy that might be of value. So just to start us all on the same page, we know that VPD and CO2 are rising and that they're likely to continue to rise. The top panel you can see in red is VPD. The light blue is, I didn't pick these colors, by the way. The light blue is CO2. And of course, temperature and humidity are also on there. This begs the question then, what could be these impacts because of their global pattern? This is happening most places. And what if they have impacts on the vegetation, if they have impacts on climate, we should probably know what they are. An example of knowing an impact is shown in the lower panel. This is soil drought, both at the 10 centimeter level and the whole rooting profile level gave similar answers. And we see a higher frequency of these severe soil droughts with time, largely due, we think, to the rising vapor pressure deficit. So some big questions emerge from this. What are the plant scale responses to rising VPD and rising CO2, both independently and together? What are the landscape scale responses to these factors? And this would be heavily including the role of disturbances, which affect things like leaf area, stomatal conductance. And then ultimately, we want to couple these knowledge at the plant and ecosystem and landscape scales to the global climate impacts. If we have changes in transpiration, albedo, et cetera, what does this do? And what are the net impacts? And I think these are questions that I'm not telling any of you anything new, but I just wanted to get going so we're all on the same page to remind me what my goals are. And I think the ultimate goals that I'm trying to pursue, and Ruby and I have been working together on, and I think many other people are getting excited about too, is we want to disentangle these antagonistic effects of rising VPD and CO2 on plants and subsequently on climate. And through doing so, hopefully we can improve model representation. I know that the models are radically advanced to where they were 5 or even 10 or even 5 years ago. I work with modelers a lot, but I do bring an empirical bias, which I'm sure you'll see in this presentation. But my take from talking to all my modeling colleagues is that there's always room for improvement. I guess that's the same as measurements. We can always do better. So I think through doing good science and goal number 1 there, we might be able to also do something of value for the larger community. So I'm going to start by in my comfort zone and think about plant physiology a little bit. This is the base scale of which I'd like to start when we're thinking about vegetation, atmosphere coupling, and the role of VPD and CO2. So I'll just start by mentioning that I was taught that Rubisco is the most abundant enzyme on Earth. It's super important, and Rubisco responds to CO2. So they have this big lever in the system that could be being driven by changes in concentration of CO2. Likewise, stomata are all over the Earth and these are the sites of water and CO2 exchange, of course. And so any changes in stomata coverage or stomatal conductance has a huge impact. on climate. But what is the role of rising VPD and CO2? It's a physiological conflict. So on the left is shown this classic photosynthetic response curve to CO2 concentration, or CI we often call it in the physiology world, because it's the intercellular CO2 concentration. And we see this great increase in photosynthesis that does saturate, notably, and this is driven by higher Rubisco carboxylation, less photorespiration. And so this leads to optimism in terms of plant growth rates. If you're into crop physiology, et cetera, or more carbon storage in the terrestrial landscape, this is a reason to say, well, there must be a driver line here that makes us store more carbon. However, as we know, VPD is going up, and in the figure on the right, we see that gross ecosystem production declines rapidly at 3 different tropical sites with increasing VPD. And we know that this is in part due to declining stomatal conductance, which reduces photosynthetic rates. So let's get into the smallest scale here and think about VPD first, and then we'll do CO2 a few slides from now. So just as a reminder, vapor pressure deficit is the evaporative demand for water from leaves, from soils, et cetera. So the blue labeled points on that figure on the left are, let's assume that is a saturated curve, that's 100% humidity in that location. That is what we often assume is the humidity and the saturation vapor pressure, therefore, inside stomata. The red line shows the atmospheric drawing power, or the vapor pressure under less than 100% humidity. And you can see that as air temperature goes up, which we know it's doing globally, VPD goes up, and it's a nonlinear relationship. We know from, again, a lot of literature over decades that transpiration increases with VPD at a constant stomatal conductance. It's just because of higher driving force. Now, typically stomata close. It's a continuum from fully open to fully closed, or as close as they can get. And as they close, we can actually see stable transpiration with rising VPD. In fact, if you push the curves far enough, which I'm showing in the lower panel of this figure, we see a decline in transpiration due to the severe decline in stomatal conductance. These are model results, but this model has been validated quite well. This impact of rising VPD on stomatal function is also manifest at the ecosystem scale. The panel on the left is a whole bunch of eddy covariance data results where we calculate conductance of the surface, of the land surface, as a function of VPD. And you can see this very consistent decline in conductance at the ecosystem scale. Likewise, gross ecosystem production from those same sites declines similarly. Now let's think about CO2. CO2 is a place where I'm trying to keep learning. I still don't fully understand all the impacts that it can have, as well as people like Anthony Walker here or other folks that know this much better than me. So I'm doing an experiment here and see how well this works. But based on my reviews of the literature, it seems like we typically get higher photosynthesis. We get reduced stomatal conductance, higher leaf area, but we don't know what the actual impacts are net impacts are on transpiration. So the figure on the right is this classic figure you all know. We have this increasing terrestrial land carbon sink. And this is largely attributed to the rising CO2 concentrations. So this is pretty clear evidence that there is CO2 fertilization. And then we can get into the mechanisms and think about, well, how does this happen? So the experiments typically done in well-watered conditions in mesic systems often show reduced stomatal conductance with higher CO2. It's in the panel on the left. However, if you look closely, that's really dominated by how many PFTs, grasses and crops, C3 and C4, which are large landscape, large dominant biome types on the Earth. So I'm not belittling that, but there are forbs, shrubs, and trees seem to not necessarily show the same pattern. So I think there's still a big question of PFT level differences in the stomatal conductance decline with CO2. Now, these changes in photosynthetic rates, which we alluded to earlier, as well as changes in stomatal conductance potentially, result in some growth variables that respond to rising CO2, it appears, such as, importantly, I would say, is leaf number and leaf area index, LAI. Because if we have increasing leaf area, we could actually have higher transpiration rates with rising CO2. Here's a study that I'm a big fan of. This is a study done in a greenhouse. Okay, so this is the most intensive level type scientific experiment we'll talk about in this talk. By intensive, I meant small scale. And in this study, they show that CO2 had no impact, no net impact on water use due to a leaf area conductance trade-off. You can see this by looking at the blue lines. Just look at the blue lines, either in the top panel or the lower panel. The top panel is weekly use and the bottom panel is cumulative use. If you look at the blue lines, that's elevated CO2 and ambient CO2 at the same temperature. So you can see there's no effect. And they showed in this case that stomatal conductance did decline a little bit, but leaf area got much higher per plant. Now, temperature seems to definitely overwhelm CO2 in driving the total water use. If you look at the red lines compared to the blue lines, you see this much higher water use. And temperature being so strongly correlated with vapor pressure deficit, especially in a greenhouse where humidity is held constant, that means that as VPD went up, we see higher water use. But what about that leaf area? Here's a study where they show that they demonstrate, at least with these data sets, that global leaf area has been increasing. You can see that with 3 different methods in the top 2 panels A, B, and C. Panel D shows the trend in leaf area. So leaf area index per year, basically, as a function of time, basically functionally, and you see a shift over time towards higher leaf area. I like the figure on the right because for me it's easy and simple. Shows the LAI anomalies are generally increasing. Now, if you look closely, I just want to mention this, at the last, let's say 10 years or 8 years of that data set, it looks to be flattening. Now, 8 years isn't enough to say much. However, people have now extended this to a longer chronology. It might be flattening. Regardless, global evapotranspiration, we think, goes up with leaf area. Here you can see total ET is the black line and LAI is the green line. And I think those are the 2 lines we want to mostly focus on. Basically, as leaf area goes up, we do expect higher ET. Now, I alluded to this earlier that there might be a flattening in the LAI anomalies over time. These are 3 recent papers that all suggest that indeed, probably using to some extent the same data sets. These are all remotely sensed data sets to a large degree that are then interpreted with models. You're all familiar with this. So if there's any bias, there may be, it might be consistent, but it does look like from these studies that VPD is starting to dominate the CO2 benefits or overwhelm the CO2 benefits. Now, maybe that's just an anomaly and it'll go away and we'll start seeing a CO2 dominance again in the future. There's a lot of questions that this brings up. However, I think it gets even more complex. We're going to go to the landscape scale now and think about VPD-driven disturbances, large scale disturbances that remove vegetation and have a big impact on transpiration potentially and carbon uptake. The figure on the right, I think, is well known to all of you from Gordon's paper in 2008, but I still like it, especially because of the lower circle that highlights vegetation dynamics. This is an often understudied, underappreciated component of the global Earth system. And I think pictures like the one on the left highlight that when these vegetation dynamics happen, a number of other things can happen, such as PFT shifts, such as large energy budget shifts, that in some cases may be quasi-permanent. Here's some examples of these disturbances that we know are heavily influenced by rising VPD. In this case, it's wildfire. All these figures are from Williams et al. 2019. And basically using the data sets from panel A on the upper left, the team was able to show in panel C and D an increase in burned area with increasing vapor pressure deficit for the Western USA. And along the lines, they showed again that for this region, VPD has been increasing. That's shown in the lower panel. Insect outbreaks are, we think, on the rise, but we don't have the evidence to say that beyond really a hypothesis at this time. The data sets from Landsat that have been put together by Matt Hansen et al. With the Google Earth Engine are reaching the maturity level soon that we might be able to not only detect change over time, but also attribute that change. When that happens, it's going to be very exciting. But in the meantime, we do have aerial detections shown on the left. You can see clear issues in terms of which states are covered better than others. But if we, for example, if we just look out west, basically any forested area has shown insect attacks. This is for, I didn't put this in the note, for the last 18 years, I believe, is what this record shows. This happens for two reasons. We have increasing insect maturation rates. The generation times are faster. They can potentially have more generations per year. But on top of that, we have this increased tree vulnerability because of greater water loss from the soils and the leaves due to rising VPD. I would note, even if we don't have greater water loss through stomatal closure, that means less carbon uptake. So what's worse for the tree when it comes to surviving insect attacks is an outstanding physiological question. So I'm going to pick apart and highlight about the great things about models and the challenging things about models in my mind. And so what to do that, so I can really be critical without worrying about offending anybody, I'm going to pick on my own work here that I did with a great team of people. For the domain shown in the lower left-hand panel for Southwestern USA, we looked at pinyon pine and juniper as well, mortality for the region. And when we did this just using Chunggang Zhu's model at the time, we found a clear latitudinal pattern that was related to temperature. The figure that really excites me is the one in the upper left. At least it provides a nice hypothesis, is that when we run these models forward, by the way, we did classic MODEX in this experiment where we first validated all of the models against a manipulative study where we droughted trees. That was actually DOE funded back in 2008, I think is when it started. Anyway, we validated the models as rigorously as we could. And then using these different models, ecosystem process models, as well as CLM, and as well as an empirical one called FDSI, we found a much greater likelihood of mortality in the future than we have now. In fact, for the remaining landscape of pinyon pine and juniper in the Southwest, we predicted that by 2050, we would lose 70% of what we have now. So that's a very bold thing to say, and it could be radically wrong. For example, if we have shifts in AMO and PDO, for example, and we slosh back into a wet cycle. We've been in a dry cycle for 20 years here in the Southwest. It could also be incorrect. Maybe it's not accounting for CO2 benefits well enough. Maybe it's not, none of these models have acclimation in them. I can pick on a few other aspects of why this could be wrong, but even if it's off by an order of magnitude, well, not an order of magnitude, maybe it's off, maybe it's twice as wrong as it should be, it's still, the trajectory is concerning, right? These models did account for rising CO2 and its impacts on stomatal conductance, by the way. But these were process models I just showed you that are focused at the tree to the ecosystem scale, largely. But if we look at models that were generated through CMIP process, for example, HAD-GM, MIRAC, MPI from Max Planck, and the bottom one's not labeled, but that's CLM. These models all actually are fairly consistent in showing something similar to what we showed for the Southwest, in that the red lines mean tree loss, conifer loss specifically, and the blue colors mean boreal, or, well, they just mean more growth, right? I would point out that for the Max Planck one in panel C, that actually when we look at the data, they actually had just as high of needle leaf conifer loss or turnover as the other models, quite significant, but the growth response was so overwhelmed this to they became fairly neutral. So what's my point is that maybe when us physiologists like I represent come into this and think, wow, we need to use these super rigorous models, super hyper fine scale models to get things right. But then when we get similar answers to potentially these Earth system models that are more from a mechanistic perspective in our minds being more simplified so you can run them at the global scale and the resolution you want, we're getting similar results, which is maybe that's exciting, or maybe we're getting similar results for different reasons. I think there's a great question there. Here's another example of an impact. VPD seems to overwhelm the CO2 benefits of water savings, at least in the 22 CMIP-5 models that were analyzed by, this was led by Chonggang Zhu. You can see definitely the number of models that predict a doubling of drought frequency. Now this is soil drought, is increasing red colors. And so clearly a lot of the landscape in the future could have a significant decline in soil moisture on average, and particularly during dry periods. Now here's the ultimate linkage that we want to make, Ruby and I think many of us, is what are the impacts of these VPD-driven disturbances on the energy, carbon, and water cycles? Disturbances, we know, can cause very dynamic changes in transpiring leaf area. They can have a big, I didn't show any evidence of this earlier, but typically when we lose the overstory forests, we lose our deep roots, at least for some temporal period, right? This could actually have big impacts on transpiration rates. Obviously, as y'all know, we also have these large changes in albedo and in the surface energy budget. So I'm making the point, I think, that rising VPD through causing disturbances actually affects more than just stomata, more than just transpiration. I think it affects many of the processes we need to get right. So let's link this up to the bigger scale now. What are the net impacts of rising VPD and CO2 on climate? This is a summary slide of some, but not all, of the evidence we have based on model analyses that suggest at the large scales we should have reduced transpiration. And they suggest that this has large impacts on the climate system and the hydrologic system, such as increasing warming, increasing stream flow, runoff, flooding, and potentially reducing drought stress. The reduced transpiration also influences climate in an atmospheric in another way, it's affecting the zonally asymmetric changes in rainfall and by influencing monsoons. But certainly, as I mentioned earlier, not just because of disturbances, but because of inherent biogeographical differences, there's substantial variation in what these potential responses and feedbacks are, such as some systems may have an increased LAI and hence an increased transpiration over time, or some disturbances likewise could do this. However, in some cases, we have reduced stomatal conductance and hence reduced transpiration. And this wasn't pointed out in the paper, but I think, equally likely is you can have increased LAI and reduced conductance and no net effect on transpiration, right? Should be a continuum across the earth. Here are some examples that I enjoyed learning about recently, and it's helping me understand the system better, is that the models suggest there is a large physiological impact on the global hydrologic cycle, this being in addition to radiative effects. The green fraction of those pie charts represents the physiological effects on 4 parameters. In panel A, it's evapotranspiration. So you can see that there's a large fraction of evapotranspiration that is accounted for strictly by physiological behavior in this model. The second panel is precipitation minus evapotranspiration. The evaporative fraction is in C and soil moisture is in D. So the main point here being that physiology matters in the models, and that's good news because I've been saying through this whole talk, physiology matters to the plants. So I think there's some convergence here that encourages me at the high level. The figure on the right is another example of big 100-year floods being a lot more likely under elevated CO2 due to the physiological effects, especially in the tropics. So again, if you look at just the physiological impacts in the green bars, see that has large impacts in some areas, whereas radiative effects are more dominant, perhaps in semi-arid areas. Models do suggest significant impacts on rainfall and on drought stress. The left-hand panels show the physiological response dominates the increased rainfall change, the zonally asymmetric change in tropical landscapes. And you can see that physiology plays a significant role in panel B. It's D there, the second global map. So it's, again, we see evidence in the model frameworks are capturing physiology in some manner similar to what we think on the ground, based on the ground measurements. I really like the figures on the right because this is where the models get the closest to my background, and I'm thinking about water use efficiency, et cetera. Especially the figure on the right, where we see that even as potential evapotranspiration, another metric for VPD, goes up over time, you can see a relatively flat, or even maybe if you squint, a decreasing evaporative flux from transpiration. And so this ratio of transpiration to VPD changes over time. And we can see that this change in precipitation minus evaporation in the maps to the left, that it's heavily, again, potentially affected by physiology. Now here's some new work from PNNL, working with E3SM, is looking at the radiative and physiological effects on precipitation at the diurnal and the seasonal cycles. So if you look at the figure in the upper left, the diurnal signal is the y-axis, the vertical axis. The seasonal cycle is the x-axis. So you can see January through December there. On the diurnal cycle on the vertical, you can see the hours of the day. I had to look at this for a while to make sure I understood it, you can tell. But you can see basically that the highest rainfall at the diurnal scale and at the seasonal scale for the Amazon, and the panel in the upper left tends to be in the late afternoon or evening, and in the winter, in the northern hemisphere winter, excuse me. And then likewise, you can see the drier periods in June, July, August, September there. So you can look at any one of these locations and attribute, we hope correctly, the diurnal and the seasonal cycles in precipitation. Where this gets even more exciting though is we can look at the mechanisms underlying these processes. So this is, I think, the funnest part. And we see, I know this is, for me, it took me a while to get through this slide, and I'll just explain it to you as well as I can. But for the different regions shown at the top of the table, we have different analyses, either using radiative only simulations, physiology only simulations, or the combined simulations in the bottom. Now, within each of those, at the very top, we have the base or control simulations. And so every value in all of the other cells represent the deviation from that base value, right? And so the delta P is the change in the diurnal cycle amplitude, but what we, for the top and so on for the other components of the equation on the left. The red highlighted rows represent the dominant effects, what the parameters were that had the dominant effects on the change in the diurnal cycle, right? And so in the case of the radiative forcing, it's the storage term of water, of humidity in the atmosphere. In the case of the physiology only, we see this strong response again of evaporation upon the change in the diurnal cycle. And I think that's the key point again, is for me, is that plants matter in this analysis for the V3SM. The evaporative flux from the land surface has the largest effect on the diurnal cycle of precipitation, which makes sense, again, from a physiological perspective. Now, Forrest, I apologize. I added one more slide in the last 20 minutes because I really like this paper and I'd forgotten about it. This is a nice analysis with 16 CMIP models under RCP 8.5, where they look at the runoff, et cetera, responses to changes in climate and CO2. And what we find in panel A is that in most regions, we have an increase in canopy resistance, meaning a decrease in stomatal conductance. If all else equal, those are fairly analogous. Panel B shows the change in canopy water flux. By the way, the red stippled areas were non-significant. All other areas had significant results with at least 80% model agreement. So you see an increase in canopy water flux, at least in the northern hemisphere, large areas of the northern hemisphere. Summer soil moisture is either non-significant or declining in this analysis, and runoff is generally increasing or non-significant. So again, we see some consistency that the models may be capturing the processes that I think about a lot. And here's an example of a model that I'm more used to. This is the hydrodynamic model within Fates, or Fates Hydro, and this is a simple schematic of it. But these representations within models, us physiology folks think, well, it must be better if we represent all of the details, rather than using a beta term, for example. Most of you are probably familiar with that, a soil moisture stress term that's very, very simple and probably doesn't capture a lot of the variability we need to. So, but am I really, is this a bias that's not really founded? And I've become very open-minded about that. Here's some results about that where we used what we consider to be these highly mechanistic finite scale models, such as Serow and Sperry, which are both tree level models, or trees and Medfates and Cable, which are ecosystem scale models. Cable goes to regional now. And what we find in the figure on the right, these are trees that did die. We had validation against observations of trees that did die at this canopy crane in Switzerland. And what we're looking at, PLC, is the percentage loss of conductance at the whole tree scale. How dehydrated and unable to move water were they? And after validating the model, we ran them forward under an elevated VPD scenario or an elevated CO2 scenario or both. And what you can see here is some logical results. And first, that VPD rising tends to cause more hydraulic failure and more likelihood of death. Elevated CO2 creates a significant water savings in the models and suggests that the trees may survive better under elevated CO2. But importantly, the 2018 model runs, that was the year the trees died, which are shown in, I guess that's a black line almost. No, that's dark green line, was almost indistinguishable from the elevated CO2 and elevated VPD scenarios. By the way, we got those from CMIP predictions for 2090 to 2100. My point being that maybe there is a net balance, but let me point out, these models didn't account for changing leaf area as an example of a limitation. So what I'm seeing is a lot of consistency between Earth system models and fine scale process models and the empirical knowledge we have from field observations and experiments. But there's some distinctions too that are compelling for us to pursue. In particular though, I find that we need to understand processes and fluxes, et cetera, better in order to improve any model representation. However, we need to also use those models to drive these measurements that we're going to do. For example, at the leaf to plant scale, the carbon and water fluxes, production, leaf area production, mortality. At the ecosystem to globe, these dynamic vegetation PFT changes, which strongly affect things like leaf area index, rooting depth, maximum hydraulic conductance, all these factors that can drive a decrease or an increase in transpiration. And ultimately, the feedbacks on the surface energy, carbon, and water budgets. Some solutions, these are just a few out of many I'm sure we can all think of, is for determining the individual and net impacts of CO2 and VPD from an empirical perspective. We need to do more manipulative experiments. We also need more observations at the ground, atmosphere, and remote sensing scales. I would just want to highlight that I think the models are advanced beyond the empirical state right now, in the sense that at least with the models, be they fine scale or global scale models, we can test hypotheses about these impacts of CO2 versus VPD. It's very hard to manipulate VPD in a controlled and empirical environment though. So we're very limited in our ability to do these tests, but I think there's going to be some clever solutions to that. Should we improve models with advanced hydraulics? Well, the argument for it is that it represents transpiration in a much more mechanistic manner than, again, using a beta factor or something. This requires a significant development. I know this is already going on in some models and already published by Kennedy et al., for example, and others. But I would advocate for heavy benchmarking. I think if the modeling community really wants to get more trust from the empirical community, and probably vice versa, it's really that model experiment benchmarking that really builds trust and builds acceptance that the science is representative of what we really think happens. So this is exciting to me. I don't know, and I think ultimately we need to compare these fine scale models and these Earth system models with observations all simultaneously, because we'll learn, oh, what mechanism does need to be represented that's not now? Or we might learn, wow, what mechanism just doesn't need to be represented anymore. I think that kind of model and model data comparison really advance us rapidly. I mentioned it already, but we need to have better representation of changes in PFTs, leaf area index, and through disturbances in particular. This is where the remote sensing and inventory data sets around the world can be used as benchmarks for distributed scale modeling. And the last point I basically already made, reconciling data and observations. So my last slide is I just want to highlight a few of my key points, which is that I think the net impact of rising VPD and CO2 at the plant scale and at the climate scale are really poorly known at this time. We have great hypotheses, but I would like to see the model data integration effort to really help us know, are these models capturing all the processes that people on the ground think are that matter, or maybe they don't matter. So we have to address that challenge. VPD and CO2 clearly have conflicting impacts on the fluxes of carbon and water that should be addressed, both mechanistically through the measurements and mechanistically through the modeling. The VPD-driven disturbances add, I think, a large additional uncertainty to the global scale and regional scale simulations of transpiration, et cetera, at the plant scale up to the feedbacks on things like rainfall. And so I think to reduce this uncertainty of global land surface and climate models, we need to make sure that we already are or will soon capture these antagonistic processes at the scales that matter. Just want to thank my support for this, and if there's time, I'm happy to chat.